Before we move on to the next piece of our linked list implementation, there is one kind of interesting thing that I wanted to point out here that might be relevant in an interview setting. Let's imagine for a second that your interviewer went through all the same tasks that we just went through, where they said, okay, let's build a linked list. And they said, let's make insert first, get last, all these kind of good methods. And then maybe at the very end, they said, hey, let's implement get at, remove at, insert at. Well, there's kind of a very interesting relationship between get at and get last and get first. So here's get at. It allows us to get some element at a given index. And then we have get first, which is always going to return the element at the very first index or the first element inside of our linked list. And then get last, which will always return the element at the very end of our list. So when we really think about it, writing get first and get last as separate implementations might not have been the best idea in the world. Here's why. Rather than writing all these separate insert first, insert last, remove first, last, get first and get last, we could have just written insert at, remove at, and get at, and then provided some appropriate arguments to each of those to manipulate some given index. So in other words, we could have just written these three methods alone and nothing else, and that would have achieved the same effect as writing all of these other ones. So if you're sitting in an interview and your interviewer says, okay, let's make a linked list, and maybe you should write a method that retrieves the first element, maybe that'd be a good time to ask them and say, hey, are we going to be doing any retrieval of any other elements? Because if we are, maybe I shouldn't write an insert first method. Maybe I should instead write an insert at method. That was going to go such an incredibly long distance in an interview setting. To have that kind of forward-looking thinking, to be able to tell your interviewer, hey, maybe here's a better way to put together this solution. Oh man, personally, if I was interviewing you, that would blow me out of the park. And so this is just an example of something that I want to throw out there, where if you're in an interview setting, it is totally appropriate to suggest something like, hey, rather than writing these very specific functions, maybe we should try to write something a little bit more generic. Now, just to give you a good idea of how this would be put together in practice, so I've taken our class linked list and I just condensed all the functions here. I'm going to uncondense them, so I'm going to unfold it all. That did not work the way I expected. We'll do this with the hotkey instead. There we go. So one possible way of doing this would be to say, rather than calling insert first right here, we could have called this dot insert at, passed in data, and then hard-coded a index of 0, because index of 0 is always going to be the first element. So let's save this and see if our tests still pass. So I'll save the file, and going down here, yep, tests are still passing. And then we could very well continue on through our implementation here. So in some cases, maybe it's a little overkill, like in the case of get first right here, but hey, why not? So maybe this would be return this dot get at with index of 0. Looks like we're still passing. Get last would be not this long implementation. I'm not going to delete this one. Let's save this code. I'll comment it out instead. And this might be return this dot get at this dot size -1. And that would still be passing. I think you get the idea here. So we could very easily go through all these more specific functions and replace them with the much more generic at functions that we had put together previously. So again, this is just something I want to throw out there as something to keep in mind when you are in an interview setting. Okay, so with that in mind, let's continue in the next section where we are going to talk about 2 additional topics about linked lists, and then we'll move on to some specific interview questions that feature linked lists. So quick break, and I'll see you in just a minute.